From Dragon of the Moon to snapping too soon, Marvel Snap players are passionate about a lot of things. But one thing they're more passionate about than anything else is yelling on the internet. This is Marvel Snap Hot Takes. Last time, you talked about the problems of Lockdown, Clog, and Doom being contrary to the dynamism of Marvel Snap. Should these exist at all? To make this hot, Move and Scream fall into the same category, and Scream is the worst offender of them all. So the problems I discussed with the cards or the archetypes that are reducing the dynamism of Marvel Snap, what I'm mostly referring to there is I think that a lot of the strength of Marvel Snap is the ability for a deck to have less points in an absolute sense than its opponent, but due to smart positioning and allocation of those points, win the game anyway, because the goal is winning 2 out of 3 locations. So by totally abandoning that third location, your opponent's investments in there are not actually contributing towards them winning the game in some scenarios. That dynamism is a thing that is often challenged by various situations. Lockdown being sort of the most prominent among them. But I don't think that that means that every deck must conform with my idea of what makes Marvel Snap good, because my idea of what makes Marvel Snap good is very specific to the kind of player that I am. I am not sort of God Emperor looking down on everyone else. I am also a type of player that should be catered to, but no more or no less than any other type of player. In as much as I think that dynamism is a strength of the game, and I also recognize that there are really important things that a deck like Lockdown brings to a game like this, really important feelings that a player may have when they play a deck like that that might not be replicatable with another deck. That kind of stuff is also quite important. And in as much as I do like these sort of more mid-rangey interactive types of games, that's just me as a player. It's not saying the game has to be like this in order for it to be an absolute better game. I think the game would be better for me, but that isn't to say that that is an absolute judgment on whether or not the game would be better, full stop. When you talk about decks like Hela or Lockdown, the big thing those decks bring is that their feelings are very big. The feelings of incremental value trading kind of things, those are small feelings. They're satisfying in a small way. But if you want something that's a big feeling that everyone can appreciate, a lot of the way to get that is a combo deck. Another thing that combo decks do that I think is really important is give people a way to sort of imagine games playing out. And I know this sounds weird, but when I was bad at card games, and I was bad at card games for a longer period of time than I've been good at card games for, the big thing that sort of kept me from getting better was that I would think a lot about how I imagined games playing out and not actually play the games. But that is also some of the most fun I've ever had. I had so much fun thinking about how cool it would be if my deck would work. Thinking about how awesome my turn, like in this analogy, turn 6 would be, or my end game combo would be. Those big feelings are actually, I think, really important to a card game. So in as much as I do believe that a lot of Marvel Snap's strength and replayability comes from this dynamism, it can't survive on dynamism alone, because you can't build a card game around people like me alone. I think if you are building a card game, you want to aim at bad KM from 10 years ago who doesn't understand what makes cards good, but really feels those feelings. That's the customer you want. There's a lot more of that guy too. And so I think that while I do appreciate that Marvel Snap has this dynamism inbuilt, I do like that they are building for that dynamism a decent amount of the time. There is, or there should be, a way to also allow for these big, powerful feelings of playing something like a Hela and bringing back all this amazing stuff, or playing something like a Lockdown deck and preventing your opponent from playing on turn 6. Those feelings are only available because they deliberately depart from the small ball dynamism that we're talking about. And I think that's also really important for a card game. The game was better before the big nerf to tech, mostly. I think I disagree with this, largely because I feel the metagame has been more dynamic and interesting since then. But that also could be like a low sample size thing. I think that there were a couple things that happened all at once that people sort of credit to the big tech nerf. Like, the fact that they made something along the lines of Invisible When First Steps right around that time. The fact that they put out some cards that are like a little bit more, let's say, not Shang-Chi-able. I think that largely when people miss the old tech nerfs, this is a take you'll get from players. We just talked about like the dynamism, the small ball versus like the big splashy stuff. The game has moved more towards the big splashy stuff after the tech nerfs, not necessarily just because of them, but because they removed the ability for decks to have sort of inbuilt counters to anything that was going super big, right? What Shang and Enchantress alongside Zabu were doing was effectively saying, you can only be this amount of tall before I start countering you. And so everything was within those lines. You had to color within those lines. And whenever something colored outside of those lines by avoiding them a different way, like Hela, that was a big problem because the way in which those things avoided it was by being totally non-interactive whatsoever. You couldn't do anything about it. It would just happen, right? I think that the current dynamic we have is much healthier. There is a spectrum of interaction and also a spectrum of point output. And decks exist in a much more healthy range right now than they did previously. Previously, it was color within the lines and play something that doesn't get Shanged or Enchantress, or play something that is a combo deck that avoids any and all possible interaction. I think those are bad lines to have for a metagame. Largely, what I like about the current metagame is that a lot of the combo decks are kind of face up, but all the interactive cards are not free to include in your deck, which means that there's a bunch of different things that can be good, but nothing is so strong as to become fully centralizing. My instinct is that this is a better state for a game than the previous, even though the previous was more appealing to me as a person, because it optimized for these sort of small ball, mid-rangey decks that I am particularly good at and I particularly enjoy. So even though I think this is a worse metagame for me, a less enjoyable metagame for me, I strongly suspect that it is a better metagame for everyone else due to the variety of options. And not that this is like an incredibly important part of it, but the more options there are, the more you're able to hide how bad card acquisition can be in this game, because people will actually be able to play a deck, right? One of the biggest problems that like Shang-Ench pile decks had is that they were always just like the 5 most recent good cards. And that is not like all 5 new cards that come out of the season go in the Shang-Ench pile deck, but it's always like, whenever something that is just a little bit better comes out, that edge matters a lot more when everything is playing within the Shang-Ench lines, if that makes any sense. The sort of marginal edges matter way, way, way more when gameplay is defined by these marginal edges, as it often is when everything is following Shang-Ench rules. That's bad for card acquisition, because it really, like, well, I guess it's bad for players is what I would say, because it means that like all these tiny little things that in a world where more decks are playable don't really matter all that much, matter drastically more when the metagame is restricted. Make Scream a 2/3. Her deck can use the love. I mean, we're really sort of circling around the same topic here, I think, a lot, because Scream needs the love, because Scream is a deck made for the metagames that don't exist anymore. Scream as an archetype is a deck that is really good at beating small ball mid-range decks by just having a slightly better scaler. We talk about like the sort of small edges that really matter when everyone is playing by Shang-Chi rules and saying like, all right, what I really want to do here is get to like 9 power on this and not go any higher. What I want to do is not be playing any ongoings. And like that, those are no longer the rules we play by. Scream was the best card at playing by those rules. by a really wide margin. Just like that was what she did. That was her specific niche in those metagames. Because of the nerf to tech, there are just going to be games where like, oh, you're playing Scream, you instantly lose to my point output. I do not care about your Scream scaling where you get like effectively 4 free points every turn because I am playing Zombie Giant Man or Xiao Lao or whatever. Fin Fang Foom. I'm playing a ramp deck. Nice Scream, dude. I don't care. Like, that is why the sort of tech changes are why Scream is bad. Which is not to say that they shouldn't buff Scream, but also it's just like, I don't actually know if that would do much for her because the problems she has are so unrelated to her own power. I suppose there's probably like a number set you could do, right? But it's so much less about her and so much more about all the other cards you have to play in her deck to make her make sense. I think it's really less about her and more about them. I'm not saying you can't buff Scream, but it is the kind of thing that, like, let's say tech does start becoming stronger and metagames become centralized around this, like, sort of small ball type mid-range, which is not incredibly far off from where we're at. I don't think we're going to be there anytime soon, right? Like, decks like Maverick or whatever still outscale Scream stuff pretty consistently. Like, I don't think we're going to be in a Scream meta anytime soon. But it is the kind of risk where it's like, if that ever does happen and you buffed her for being good in a metagame that is hostile to her, what happens when the metagame isn't hostile to her? Does that make her like a little bit overpowered? And I think Scream is a card that carries that risk. Alliances were pitched as a way to enhance the social experience. They fail at that. Instead, they are used solely to extract rewards. Eliminate alliances and replace them with reworked leagues or some other concept that is purely individual. I think alliances were a failure for me too. I basically don't engage with them at all. I haven't engaged with them in an extremely long period of time. It quickly became obvious that I do not care for additional quests to do this kind of stuff. It just is not appealing to me. The social experience of the game for someone like me is entirely outside of the Marvel Snap app. It is in my YouTube comments. It is in my Discord. It is in all of these different places. It is not in the Marvel Snap app. And I realize that's a very unique position to be in, but I don't think the social experience being outside the Marvel Snap app is that unique. The way in which it is for me is unique, but I think for most people, the social experience of Marvel Snap does not happen within the Marvel Snap app. So when you say they became a way to farm rewards, to me, I think that's what they always were to most people. I see a lot of people talking about alliances a lot. I'm the last person to talk about it because I don't care. I got 2 weeks into alliances and I was like, I hate doing these quests. I hate it. This is not worth it. I'm not doing it. I'm done. And I just never did an alliance quest again. And I think that that's probably the reaction people are supposed to have. Because I think if you really hate doing something, making yourself do it for just do the math on how much money it is and how much time you're spending. It's like, oh, I'm going to spend an hour of my day to earn $10. You could just do that at a job. Like, just take a DoorDash order, dude. Like, that would be way, way easier. And it's not even an hour of your day. It's like multiple hours out of your week. And I know that it's like, I think maybe most people don't think of it that way. And, it's like, oh, I'm still playing a game. I'm still having fun. But I think for a lot of people, you're not having fun. Because when you log on to play a game, you want to play the deck you want to play. You're like, oh, I've been thinking all day about playing this deck that I devised in my head. And then I log on and all my alliance quests are like, play Patriot. It's like, I don't want to do that. That is work. Like, you should probably understand it as such. And I think that if you start thinking about things in those terms, you'll realize just how mediocre a deal doing extra chores in a game is for like free pixels or whatever. I've never been big for this kind of stuff. I know it's like an important mechanic in games for like retention and whatever, but to me, it's always just like something I kind of have to ignore or it'll make me hate the game. And I think that people who are in the process of hating the game because they're doing these chores, like, stop doing the chores. I really, that is genuinely, it's what I do. It's what I recommend other people do. The chores are not why you play the game. You play the game to have fun. If you're not having fun because of the chores, either don't play the game or don't do the chores. Room temperature take, Bounce needs a buff. I think this is a pretty good take, and yeah, it's a little room temperature, but the reason I'm putting it on here is because it relates to a topic we've talked about a lot on this episode, which is, you talk about these decks, it's hard to sort of define like an interactive deck versus a non-interactive deck, a mid-range deck versus a combo deck. To me, Bounce has always sort of been the smallest combo deck, which is really good in Shang-Chi land, because in order to, like, it balances being the smallest combo deck with being one of the hardest combo decks to interact with, because all of its cards are face down in the final turn of the game. So you get a bunch of really good ways to dodge like these sort of tech slop decks that were pretty dominant before the nerf. That's always kind of been Bounce's premise. It's honestly a fairly similar premise to Hela, which is why I'm not sure you actually want to buff it, because the way I conceive of combo decks in Marvel Snap is largely on an axis of interactability and power. What are the things that interact with this? How played are those things? And how many numbers am I making at the end of the game? The decks that are risky are not the ones that are really high on the power scale. It's the ones that are really high, or really low, I should say, on the interactability scale. If a deck gets really popular because it does a lot of numbers, but people can play cards to interact with and stop their game plan, that's fine. If a deck does a lot of numbers and there just aren't meaningful ways to interact with it, and you end up having to like cobble them together out of like Invisible Woman and Killmonger, that's bad. That's really bad. So to me, when you look at a combo deck like Bounce, you look at a combo deck like Hela, you look at a deck like Cerebro, right? A lot of what makes those decks strong is the lack of interactability, the lack of a card that people can play to do something about this. That's the thing they have that's a strength. And to me, that makes them the most risky cohort of decks in the game to buff. Bounce might skate because the point output is low. But at a certain point, it doesn't have to be the highest point output in the game. It just has to be higher than the mid-range decks. And as long as it's uninteractable, it's just going to win those matchups. I consider it actually a little bit more risky than you might think to buff decks in that cohort of lack of interactivity. Like, it is notable. There are things that can happen to Bounce decks, but it's not nearly so pronounced as, say, you know, okay, Hell is really popular, I'll play Stardust. Mr. Negative is really popular, I'll play Mobius. You're going to have to devote multiple slots in your deck, and at that point, it becomes maybe not even worth it to do it if you want to beat Bounce. I do think it's a little risky. Mill shouldn't be an archetype. One of the things that's always been pretty surprising to me is the delta between how good players perceive Mill and how, I guess you'd call like general population perceive Mill. Because if you ask anyone who's good at this game, like, what do you think about Mill? They'll be like, it's trash, just awful, abysmal, just like never been a good deck, absolutely terrible. Maybe there were like 2 weeks where it was like moderately playable, but mostly it is just not a functional strategy. And the like, for lack of a better term, like the sort of Reddit population seems very concerned with the archetype, which is, I think, indicative of a couple things. Like, on one level, one of the things that I think people are missing is that, like, when you get rid of a card from my deck, there is a chance that card is bad. Like, that's a card I want to draw. There's also a chance it's a card I don't want to draw, and you're actually getting me closer to the card I do want to draw. An example of this would be, like, imagine I'm playing a Hela deck, right? All I want to do is draw Hela. You're Yonduing me. What you're doing is getting me closer to Hela. That's what's happening there. When you cable me, maybe you're not guaranteed to get me closer to Hela, but the odds are actually in my favor that you're getting me closer to Hela. You know what I mean? You are more likely to get a card that isn't Hela and draw me closer to my Hela than you are to do the opposite. The same is true for things like Cerebro, things of that nature. Like, you are more likely to get me closer to the card that I want to get to than to actually get that card, because that's how math works. When I'm playing Cerebro, there are 11 cards that aren't Cerebro and then Cerebro. So you're more likely to get one of the other ones. That kind of stuff, I think, is one part of, like, why people look at it this way, because they remember, like, oh, my opponent, you know, they cabled me, they snapped, they got the card that was actually perfect. Like, but the other thing that I think is important here about Mill is not just that, oh, everyone who thinks Mill is like strong is wrong. Because I actually think there's another thing going on here. I think people respond really negatively to options being foreclosed to them. Like, we talk about dynamism in Marvel Snap games and doing what you actually wanted to do with your deck and the importance of feeling like the thing you put together in your brain was being represented on the field. And I think that Mill is uniquely disruptive to that feeling in a way that is actually real. Like, in as much as I will say it's not a good deck and people worrying about it, I don't know why you'd worry about a matchup you'd win. That's true, but I do think that the anxiety over it speaks to something real, which is the foreclosure of options, the feeling of games ending early, the asymmetry of the information available. All of those things, I think, are real. And I think that it is, like, if you loop this around, I think this is actually kind of a pretty valid take, where, like, I think a lot of the players in my cohort would be like, what are you talking about? This deck sucks. What do you mean it shouldn't be real? It already isn't real. I think it's actually pretty valid to be like, it's probably bad for the game if a deck that sucks and also makes people feel like this while it sucks is around. I think that's actually like super valid. Personally, like, I think the fact that Mill is as bad as it is and people still hate it like this is actually indicative of the truth of this take. The game is just not as fun as it used to be, and it feels like a chore to play. I'm serious when I say this. If you feel like a game is becoming a chore, you need to stop playing the game. I'm gonna, like, I cannot stress this enough. If you feel like a game is becoming a chore, you should stop playing the game. I have had this experience with many games in the past, especially online games that offer repetitive rewards for logging in and completing game actions. They started feeling like chores, and once they started feeling like chores, I wasn't enjoying them. Once you feel like you have to do this, stop. Like, this is genuinely from the heart my best advice. If you feel like you have to do something and you don't want to do it, don't do it. Put it down. Put the game down. Go outside. Go to the gym. Play a different game. I don't care. But I'm serious here. You have a very limited amount of time on this planet. If you spend any amount of time doing shit you don't want to do and not getting paid for it, I think you're doing something wrong. Like, you should do the shit you like. I'm not going to like make this like a wide take because like, yeah, a lot of people have jobs that suck and they have to do work that they don't want to do. Don't make your leisure time be that too. I don't think this is an inherent quality of the game because it's happened to me across a bunch of different games where I start feeling like the game is less fun and I'm really only logging on to get my free whatevers. Stop. Free yourself from that. I'm serious. Like, you take those mental chains off. The Marvel IP is probably the biggest downside to Marvel Snap. That said, it takes a great team to make a not cringeworthy world story for a CCG like Snap. I love Once Upon a Galaxy, but the cards are so goofy, it's honestly more embarrassing to talk about in public than Snap or MTG. Couple things going on here. First one that I think is important is I also thought the Marvel IP was a downside when I first started playing this game. That's because the only Marvel I was familiar with was the MCU. And I started reading comics and I was like, oh, okay, this is actually pretty nice. Not all comics, like there's some stinkers out there. But I think if you feel like the Marvel IP is a downside, I recommend you go read Immortal Hulk. I think that's just a really good comic run. It's what got me to start caring about the comic side of Marvel and not just like, oh, the MCU. Because I think it's pretty reasonable to say the MCU is cringe. Like, that's a pretty reasonable thing. With regards to like being embarrassed to talk about shit in public, I think you need to free yourself of that personally. Like, oh, the cards are so goofy in this game, I actually enjoy it. Do you enjoy it? That's fine. Stand on the things you enjoy. To me, that's what you got to do. Like, yeah, is it embarrassing to talk about, you know, how cool you think Star-Lord is? Sure. Embarrassing to who? It's filtering out people who wouldn't get along with you anyway. You're going to be okay, man. All right, y'all. Thank you so much for watching. As always, I've been KMBest. You've been phenomenal. And apologies to Mike Trapp, Ifiwadiwe, and the entirety of Dropout for that incredibly net-decked opener. Thanks so much. Remember to like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.